U.S. and Mexico are planning a summit in Washington next Wednesday after President Trump threatens to slap tariffs on Mexico unless it helps stop the overwhelming flow of illegal immigration at the border. Garrett Tenney at the White House with the very latest on this. Hi, Garrett.
David, good morning to you. The first round of these tariffs will take place 9 days from now, and it will be at 5%, starting at 5%. But then it'll jump another 5% each month, all the way to 25%, until President Trump is satisfied that Mexico is doing enough to stop the flow of migrants reaching the U.S. border. Mexican officials are hoping to avoid that, though, by reaching some sort of diplomatic solution. And they will be having a summit here in D.C. this next week, with Mexico's foreign minister meeting with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to discuss the tariffs. And on Friday, Mexico's foreign minister tweeted, boarding a flight to Washington via Houston, I just had a call with Jared Kushner and Mike Pompeo. The negotiation process begins. I heard interest and respect for the letter from President Lopez Obrador. Now, the White House is facing a lot of blowback over this latest move, which would make everything from electronics and car parts to food and medicine more expensive for Americans. Here is the executive vice president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
It's exactly the wrong thing that our economy needs right now. And then to top it off, it does nothing to solve the very real problem at the southern border. The problems that we have of migrants crossing the border has nothing to do with our trading relationship with Mexico.
A number of Republican lawmakers are also criticizing this move by the president, but the White House argues that it has to do something because so far Congress has refused to take action to address this crisis.
We're asking Mexico to enforce their own laws to help stop the people coming in from Central America. We've seen a massive influx of people coming from that region, and they have certainly the ability and the legal authority in which to deal with it, and we're simply asking them to do that.
This week's summit will be missing the most important player in all of this, President Trump, who will be over in Europe. And since he's the one with the final say and often overrules his own advisors, there are a lot of questions over how much real progress can be made during this week's meetings. David?
Garrett, thank you very much. Well, the same week we see border agents apprehend the largest group of migrants ever on the southern border, 1,036 to be exact, on one day at one location. President Trump is threatening Mexico with new tariffs unless it helps stop the flow of illegal immigrants. Mark Daniels is the sheriff of Cochise County in Arizona. Sheriff, great to see you. Thank you for being here. You know the complaints, and you just heard them from the business community about these tariffs. What would you tell those people who say our economy is more important than what's going on at the border, or at least maybe this isn't the right way to deal with that?
Well, good morning, David. And I 100% agree with what you're saying there, is the fact that when is economy more important than public safety? And one of the most frustrating things for sheriffs, the 31 sheriffs on the southern border, to include our federal partners from Border Patrol and ICE, is the fact that nobody's listening to us. We're down here on this crisis, which is a true crisis, not a manufactured crisis, it's a real crisis, and nobody's listening. So we commend the president for doing this. It brought Mexico to the table next week. Mexico is vital to solving this problem.
You know, it is an incredible situation where for months, literally for over a year, the media and most Democrats were refusing to admit there was a problem. We had Beto O'Rourke at the border about a month and a half ago saying there was no problem. His words. That must have been incredibly frustrating for you, particularly as we're seeing now the evidence of the crisis at the border. There was one El Paso processing center, just one center, at which on May 7th they had 650 people come in. On May 8th they had 900 people come in. And the maximum capacity for that processing center was 125. They are completely overwhelmed.
They are. And for former Congressman O'Rourke to say that, El Paso's his home, they've had 131,000 migrants come through El Paso processing stations this fiscal year, second largest numbers on the southwest border. And I looked at his plan. He has developed a plan for immigration reform. The plan pretty much takes away everything President Trump is doing and sets up an open border policy. He wants to set up more lawyers down there on the border.
President Trump's tariff threats on Mexico until they get serious about helping us with the crisis at the border. Now to a Trump supporter who is not a fan of tariffs. Heritage Foundation chief economist Steve Moore joining us now. Steve, I know you agree that the crisis at the border is absolutely real. You've been talking about it for over a year now. Democrats have dithered and denied that it was a crisis at all. This is a reaction to the crisis, the president's threats on Mexico. Is it a good reaction?
Well, you're right, David. I hate tariffs, and in some cases, though, I think they're appropriate to use. I've been supportive of what Donald Trump is doing with the Chinese. I think that's the epic battle of our time. I think we're in an abusive relationship with China. But I'm questioning this one with Mexico. Now, I've worked with Donald Trump now for 3 years, and one of the things I've learned about him is he's a master negotiator, and he uses these kind of tactics to try to get concessions from countries, and I hope that's what happens here. I think that the White House is meeting with the Mexicans later this week. I'm hoping and praying that what we get is an agreement with Mexico that they'll get tougher on the border and we don't have to have these tariffs, because I think the timing is wrong here, David. I think if we want to win this epic struggle that we have with China, we want to isolate China as the bad actor on the international scene and not pick fights with our allies. Mexico is one of our most important allies. Yeah. But we'll see how this turns out, and I think we'll learn a lot more after this White House Mexico meeting
the summit
later this
on Wednesday.
week.
Yeah, but the irony of the Friday announcement, yesterday's announcement, was it came the day after the president said he was going to fast track the Mexico-Canada trade deal, the USMCA, and this really puts questions on whether that's going to go through. I mean, he's antagonizing the very people he's trying to solidify the deal with.
Well, I think there's some truth to that, David. And again, far be it from me to question President Trump's tactics, but I think there's a lot to what you're saying. It's so critically important at this juncture that we get this Mexico-Canada-U.S. agreement done. It'll strengthen the president's position vis-a-vis China. And so, one day he's saying, let's get rid of the tariffs that we have between our countries. And the next day he's saying, well, we're going to impose new tariffs. So I think that does make it a little bit problematic. But look, I do think at the end of the day, there aren't going to be these tariffs on Mexico. I think the president is going to get a deal with the Mexicans.
Although there's not a lot of time.
Well,
what was it, about 10 days, right?
Yeah. So, but look, Trump is in the past, he's delayed these things, when he feels like he's making progress.
True.
But, we want U.S., Canada, and Mexico to be a big free trade zone so that we can, be a powerful alliance against, some of these countries like China. So, we will see. But look, you look at the job this president has done in the economy. It is so fantastic. I just don't think we want new tariffs right now with our southern neighbor.
Well, then you have China, and you touched on it already. But, for the longest time, the president was warning about the crisis of the border. He wasn't believed. For the longest time, he's been warning about China, the threat from China. And in fact, now it seems a lot of people are on board of that. Big piece in the Wall Street Journal last week, big piece in the Washington Post about the threat from Huawei and others. But what are the dangers? None of this comes without risk. It comes risk to consumers in the United States, risk to producers who deal with China. I mean, how bad will those risks hurt our economy?
Well, they've already, caused a lot of havoc in the stock market. You cover that every day, David. And, I don't even want to look at my 401k plan over the last couple weeks, because we've seen a more than 1,000-point decline in the Dow. Look, I do think that this is this is an incredibly important dispute we have with Mexico. Everything that Donald Trump is asking of the Mexicans, David, of the Chinese, is very reasonable. Yes, they should open up their markets. Yes, they should reduce their tariffs. Yes, they should stop stealing our intellectual property and engaged in cyber espionage against the United States. So, my problem with what's happening with this Mexico dispute is maybe it's changing the focus away from where it should be. We need to get every country. That's why we have to have these free trade deals with Britain. We got to get a deal with the Europeans, with Japan, so we can focus the attention on the real bad actor on the international scene, which is China, because we're involved in a very abusive relationship with China right now.
By the way, there's some breaking news, which is actually good news on the Mexican front. The president of Mexico, Lopez Obrador, said on Saturday he was encouraged by the U.S. willingness to have a dialogue over a
Good.
plan with Donald Trump. So it looks like we're making progress. Finally, you also touched on the economy, which, again, 3.1% growth. It was actually a tick less than what was expected, but still over 3% growth for the first quarter of this year. We had the CBO announce, by the way, that there was an increase in revenues from taxes. Everybody who's been dumping on the president's tax plan said, oh, it's going to cost us a lot of money. In fact, there's been so much economic growth that it's leading to more tax revenue, 2% increase in the last 7 months. So for all the stuff that continues to be dumped on the tax plan, isn't this another example of how supply side economics, which is lowering tax rates, lowering regulations, really works?
You better believe it. I mean, and by the way, in 2018, over the last 12 months, the United States federal Treasury has received more tax revenues, David, than at any time in American history. Now, tell me how that means we have a revenue problem. I mean, we have a spending problem in Washington, but we don't have a revenue problem. The supply side economics is working. The economy, look, we have right now today in America 1.5 million more jobs than the number of unemployed people in the country. Even if we put every unemployed American in a job today, we'd still have 1.5 million jobs left over. Yeah. I mean, we're very proud of this. And by the way, did you see the news this week? I think it just came out yesterday that you're my buddy and my mentor, Arthur Laffer, is going to win the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And boy, does he deserve it, because he's been the architect of not just the Reagan tax cuts, which boomed our economy, but now the Trump tax cut as well.
He is a legend in economics. And that's on June 19th, I think, the award ceremony. So we'll be watching that closely.
I'm going to go. I'm privileged. I'm going to be in the Oval Office when the president gives Art Laffer that award.
Yeah, it's going to be worth noting. Again, June 19th on that. Steve Moore, great to see you, Steve. Thank you very much.
You too, Dave.
From the battle at the border to the mess over Mueller, more House Democrats ramping up calls for impeachment. But is there any evidence to justify that? House Judiciary Republican Tom McClintock reacts, coming next. Joining us now. So what did you think of Mr. Mueller's statement?
I thought it was pettifoggery. Pettifogger is an attorney whose tactics are petty, underhanded, and disreputable, or someone who quibbles over trivial matters. That describes Mueller's statement to a T. We gave him and his team $25 million and 22 months to investigate this monstrous lie that the president was a traitor and was an agent of a hostile foreign government. And after all of that time, one of the most partisan investigative teams ever assembled, with some of the most abusive prosecutorial tactics I've ever seen, they came up with nothing. So now that has been laid bare, they have to come up with a new lie, and that's obstruction. Well, good luck proving obstruction when there was no underlying crime. The president gave them every document requested, over 1 million documents turned over, and even waived attorney-client privilege and executive privilege to allow Don McGahn to testify for 30 hours.
Well, there's also a question of how they put the report together. Of course, a lot of Democrats have been poring over the report, trying to find any evidence that the president is guilty of something. But Republicans are doing the same, and Devin Nunes used to be head of the judiciary, the position that Jerry Nadler now has.
Actually, oversight.
Oversight. Forgive me. You're right. But Devin Nunes found that one of the references made in the Mueller report to a conversation between the president's lawyer and a lawyer for Michael Flynn was totally misrepresented in the report. It didn't give the full context. It made it seem like they were conspiring to prevent information from getting out, when that isn't at all what happened. So the way this report was put together kind of reflected the bias of the people working for Mr. Mueller.
Well, and don't forget, his initial team included Strzok, Page, McCabe, the very people who we are now learning were the instigators of this hoax.
I have to say, forgive me, but I have to say that when these messages between Strzok and Lisa Page were discovered, he was immediately taken off the committee by Mr. Mueller.
Yes, correct. But only after they were discovered. All of these partisans, hyper-partisans, were deliberately selected for this investigative team. Every member of that team who made political contributions contributed to Clinton and the Democrats. Andrew Weissman was the head of the team, was actually at the Clinton victory celebration in 2016 that turned a little sour at the end. So I mean, and even so, with that amount of bias, with these pre-dawn SWAT raids on individuals, threatening people's relatives, setting perjury traps, after all that, they could not make a case for collusion. And the only case they can even suggest for obstruction is based on the president blowing off steam behind closed doors that amounted to absolutely nothing.
Well, and then there's a larger question here, which is Mr. Mueller's description of the way our system of justice works. Let me just play a little soundbite from his testimony or from his statement this week and get your reaction.
If we had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. We did not, however, make a determination as to whether the president did commit a crime.
Now, some people say that's turning our standard of jurisprudence on its head. That is, we're all guilty until proven innocent.
Yeah, and a prosecutor's job is not to exonerate people. A prosecutor's job is to assemble a case. That is what he was specifically instructed to do. If there's a case for collusion, if there's a case for obstruction, you make a prosecutorial recommendation. He didn't do that because he couldn't do that. There is no case. And now he's coming back, dropping little innuendos and saying, oh, by the way, don't question me. Well, I'm sorry, the process doesn't work that way. He's accountable for this investigation. The fact that he had showed absolutely no interest in the genesis of this hoax, the fact that that officials at the highest levels of the Justice Department, the FBI, our intelligence agencies were actually colluding to develop and foist this hoax on the American people. There were two governments that were interfering in the 2016 election. There was the Russian government, but there was also the Obama administration.
Well, we're going to get we are going to get a lot of information about. Maybe Mr. Mueller didn't do enough diligence on that side of the story, but we're going to have an IG report coming out. Mr. Uber's coming out, and of course, Mr. Barr is going to be coming out with his own report. I just want to ask you about your committee, though, which is now headed by Jerry Nadler. Jerry Nadler spoke right after Mr. Mueller spoke. Yeah. It was a written statement that he didn't seem to be familiar with. He kind of flubbed some of what he was reading, but it did seem he was asked a specific question about whether he would subpoena Mr. Mueller to come before the committee, and he seemed kind of afraid to answer. He did not answer it directly. He went back to his written statement. I'm just wondering if he's afraid that people like you will ask Mr. Mueller questions that Mr. Mueller can't answer well.
Well, I want Mueller to testify before Congress. He's accountable for the conduct of his investigation. I'd like to know why he ignored the genesis of this hoax. I'd like to know why he appointed this highly partisan team of investigators. I'd like to know how long it took for them actually to realize there was no case for collusion and why that wasn't made immediately known to the American people. After all, this hoax is not only did they use it to try to interfere with the 2016 presidential election. When they failed to do that, they've been using it for the last 2 years to undermine the constitutionally elected president of the United States. That's big stuff. And the fact that he was charged with investigating all that and didn't, I think he's got a lot of questions to answer.
All right, we have to go, so it's literally got to be a 5-second answer. But the bottom line is, if Jerry Nadler is listening to you right now, you want him to subpoena Mr. Mueller.
Very much, and it's his responsibility to do so, and it's something that he's been promising to do, so let's do it.
Tom McClintock, good to see you, sir. Thank you very much for coming in on the weekend. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Will all this talk of impeachment bring Trump down in 2020 or perhaps boost it?
Go down this road of impeachment, even though they don't necessarily approve of the job that the president is doing. And I think that if Democrats go down this road, they're going to turn off a lot of Democrats, and they're also going to turn off those that voted for Trump in 2020 and voted for Obama in 2008.
But if they don't go for impeachment, they're going to tick off a lot of Democrats that want it.
This is why Nancy Pelosi is trying to say, look, don't go down this road. You have to keep in mind that in 2018, 31 districts turned for Democrats, right? And those were in districts that Trump won. So what they run the risk of is that in 2020, turning the House back red, and now you're going to have a red House, a red Senate, and possibly an executive office that is with Donald Trump if he wins again. So there's a lot at risk if they go down this impeachment road.
Of course, sometimes I think that may be, I sense from the president, it's just my own opinion, that he's kind of baiting Democrats to go on the impeachment route, you know?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of brinkmanship because I know that he knows that the pendulum is ready to swing back the other way. Rochelle's right. Even when Democrats...
And a lot of them take the bait, by the way.
Oh, they sure do. You have someone like Jerry Nadler who's just chomping at the bit, ready to push this along. Right. But even if you look at when they won seats in 2018, exit polls showed that this wasn't an issue that drove voters to vote for Democrats in many of these districts. Look at who's winning the 2020 polls right now. It's Biden and Bernie, and both of them have been very moderate in their approaches to impeachment.
But, Kat, the question is, could we have a situation like 2016 where the left wing is really ticked off about the way they're being treated? We're already getting reports this week that some people working for Bernie Sanders, and maybe Bernie Sanders himself, thinks, oh, God, here we go again. I'm going to get stiffed on this race against the establishment guy.
Right, and those concerns are certainly well-founded because we know what happened in 2016. I mean, Debbie Wasserman Schultz had to resign because she was so involved in essentially helping to rig the election for Hillary Clinton. So if they are upset, they have every right to be upset. But at the same time, I see how very left candidates can influence some of the more moderate candidates and encourage them to be a little more progressive. We certainly saw that in 2016 with Hillary Clinton and Bernie's influence on her. But I don't see them being the candidates that people ultimately go with or as a presidential candidate.
And Hillary was more ripe for the progressive side than I think Joe Biden is.
Yes.
I think he's more of a moderate in his core. But Rochelle, do you worry about the left-wing part of your party that wants impeachment, that wants to go more progressive than Biden? After all, I believe 12% of Bernie Sanders supporters in 2016 actually ended up voting for Donald Trump, according to polls. So could that happen again?
Well, that's certainly a risk. And what we don't want to see happen is that if Bernie does not get the nomination, we don't want to see what happened with Hillary Clinton, where Bernie supporters were so upset that they didn't turn around and support the DNC candidate that they had put forth. I think that is a risk. But one of the things that I want to say as far as Democrats, I want to go back to this impeachment really quick, is that if we are concerned about protecting our democracy and protecting our elections, then why are we not putting forth legislation that does that? Why, if we're concerned that the president colluded or that he obstructed justice, why are we not focusing on putting legislation on the books so that this does not happen again?
But
that's where
what
the focus should be.
legislation would Democrats and Republicans ever agree to before the election?
But they should agree to it because it should be about protecting our elections.
By the way, we have live shots, I believe, of Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Where is he, in San Francisco? Yeah, he's in San Francisco talking right now. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Rochelle, but I believe that he actually has come out for impeachment, hasn't he?
Yes, he has. He did.
You have all these Democrat candidates out there who are for impeachment, who are for the Green New Deal, or at least initially were. How do they back away from that if it's not popular on the campaign trail?
When you think about what issues they've been talking about, flatulent cows and things, you think maybe impeachment might be
That's the most important issue to me. I don't know, man.
Who cares about that? That's right.
Impeachment is not what's going to take Democrats to the promised land. It just isn't. You watched some Democrats read the Mueller statement like they're reading the Old Testament, trying to find hidden meanings in every word. It's just not what voters want to care about.
But, Kat, getting beyond impeachment for the moment, you look at what Mayor Pete has been for, you look what Kamala Harris is for. I mean, they're pretty far to the left. Are they going to temper that at all on the campaign trail, do you think?
I certainly don't think so. Progressives have been getting more and more progressive. I remember it when 2016, it was just Bernie, and that's why he stood out. Now, there's many candidates who are very progressive, as the ones that you named. I think that they're going to stick to their guns on this issue, and ultimately, I think they're going to push whoever gets the nomination, who I think will be more moderate, they're going to push that person a little further left, like what happened with Hillary Clinton, because there is that progressive wing. Although they might not be in leadership, they do have influence.
Rochelle, we have this. We thought we had a spectacle in 2016 of all the Republicans on stage. Now, the Democrats have topped that with, 24 candidates. Now, what's going to happen in these debates? Are they going to be about the substantive issues of whether or not you're in favor of the Green Deal or not, or are they going to be focused just on Donald Trump and how bad he is and impeachment, et cetera?
I really hope they focus on the issues, because I'm going to be honest with you. I'm really tired of hearing about the Russian investigation. I do think that
most Americans agree with you.
we do need to protect our elections and our democracy, and I would like to hear more about how we're going to do that, and less about the attacks on Trump. They need to focus on the issues. There are still plenty of Americans out here who are concerned about their health care, they're concerned about their jobs, they're concerned about immigration, and they need to focus on the issues and beat him on the policy. That's where Biden would compete well with Trump. He can go toe-to-toe with him on policy because he came out of the recession, the immigration issues.
Well, he did, but he didn't come out of the recession, Joe, that well. I mean, this was the worst recovery of a recession in my lifetime. And in fact, the economy is growing a lot stronger now than it was during an amalgam of the Obama years.
Sure, and people are saying that Pennsylvania would be Joe Biden's best swing state, but I have a hard time imagining Joe Biden going in there convincing people that the Obama administration was much better than the Trump administration. I mean, it's like convincing people that the sky is
But it's not
green
about it being better. What I'm saying is that he can compete with him
He's
on
to blame.
how to come out of a recession.
He's to blame, but
No,
he did have. I remember the recovery summer in 2010, Kat, when he said there were going to be 500,000 jobs every month. It turned out over the next 3 months there were less than 200,000. So he's got a track record, which is a little off.
Little off. Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a tough thing for the Democrats, how well the economy is doing. At the same time, though, when you look at how well the economy is doing, the president's numbers really should be higher than they are on overall approval. So that's something you need to look at and just consider all angles of.
Gang, you're great. Good to see you all. Thank you for being here. Well, Major, Mr. Gilkey, tell us about that levee and what's the situation? Are floodwaters still rising?
Yes, we currently have floodwaters rising, and they're near in the city of Dardanelle. It's got a population of 4,500, and we could see 350 affected by this rising floodwaters.
Now, you say 350 affected. Does that mean homes destroyed, 350, or at least underwater right now?
No, we're not talking underwater. We're talking affected. Most of these homes are elevated high enough that we're not going to have a water going in over the homes. We'll have water going into the homes possibly, and affecting those. Most of these homes, will not be affected, but if they are most certainly be repairable.
Do you have enough funds in state to manage this, or do you need help from the feds?
Well, we do need the federal government's help, and fortunately, President Trump made a presidential declaration, FEMA 3414 EM, which is allowing us to have access to federal assets and support, and this allows us to do emergency work to protect the population. This allows us to spend money and get reimbursed on the back end.
Now, we talked about the homes. What about the businesses and particularly the farming areas? With all these tariffs that we've been talking about and everything, people are worried about American farms like never before.
Our farms are suffering right now. We've had heavy rains throughout the year, and a lot of the crops hadn't been planted. We've had a few that were planted, and they're going to be lost. And that area down there where the levee was breached is all farmland.
Wow. Now, is the federal help that you're receiving going to help in that regard?
Yeah, it should help. Hopefully we can get some disaster aid to all these farmers down there, and we just hope it's going to be enough to offset their losses.
Arkansas has a history of folks when crisis hits working together. Are people from parts of the state that are less effective chipping in now?
Yeah, we've had some of the best volunteers throughout the state of Arkansas and our local community. Once we started the sandbagging effort last weekend, we've had people come from all across Arkansas to help us sandbag and deploy sandbags to the homes in the low-lying areas of Yell County and the city of Dardanelle.
And nothing like neighbors, and you have the best neighbor. Wednesday over President Trump's threat to hit Mexico with tariffs if it doesn't help stop the flow of illegal immigrants. U.S. car dealer and former President Trump campaign finance committee member says tariffs on Mexico could backfire on the U.S. and perhaps on President Trump. Tom Maioli joining us now. Tom, good to see you.
How you
Thank
doing?
you very much. I'm fine. So how could this cost us if the tariffs kick in?
Well, clearly the consumers are the ones that are going to suffer. This price has to be passed along. 20% of all parts in manufactured cars come from Mexico. And the more staggering number is that 70% of the wiring harnesses, a wiring harness is the first thing that's put into a vehicle on the assembly line. You'll shut down the assembly line. I mean, you're talking about thousands of people that are going to be out of work.
The other thing is that as they cross the border, sometimes these parts cross several times.
Several times.
The parts go from the U.S. to Mexico, then they go from Mexico to U.S., then go back again to Mexico. So a 25% tariff could become a 50% tariff or a 75% tariff.
That's correct. And, I own automobile dealerships and, I'm in the business and I'm seeing the consumers suffer. I mean, they're coming in and they're complaining about the price of a car. The cost of their payments of the car have risen. Interest rates have risen. This on top of it, Ford, Chrysler and General Motors have already stated that it's cost them $1 billion a year for the tariffs that are put in place. Now we're going to put this on top of it. I think you're talking about a Lehman type. We're going to go back to Lehman type numbers. Car sales are going to plummet.
Now, you were for the president in 2016. You know how bad things are at the border right now. They're really in crisis stage. We've been talking about that all day. This was one of the president's signature platforms that he was elected on. So what did you expect? I mean, since Mexico hasn't gotten tough the way we need them to get tough to stop the flow, what else could we do besides tariffs?
Well, listen, I think he's doing the right thing. We have to deal with the border issue. The border issue is a major issue. We have to deal with it. This it's a threat. Right. And I think that the president of Mexico has come to the table already. I think he's encouraged. I saw some news this morning. There was some news alerts out there. So I think it'll get resolved. I think he could probably implement one tariff, 5%, 25%. I think plummets the industry. I think not only are we talking about, the cars that are built overseas and Japan and China. We're talking about U.S. auto manufacturers. This is the backbone of our country.
Now, if the higher tariffs do kick in and if they last for a while, would you withdraw your support from the president?
No, not at all. I'm a clear Trump supporter. He's a friend, and I've supported him all along, and I will continue to support him. Listen, I think he's doing the right thing.
Even if it hurts your own business?
Yeah, I think so. I think in the long run, you have to sacrifice something, right? I mean, he's out to help the country. He's making the right decisions. It's our security is first and foremost, and business is second. And, listen, the business is going to come back. People will come back and buy cars. The interesting part about it in my business, in the retail automotive business, you're either selling cars or fixing cars, right? So if people aren't buying cars, they're fixing their cars more. Now comes the dilemma is, can we get those parts? Because assembly lines are shut down, and what are the cost of those parts?
I got to say, though, it is pretty impressive that you would be willing to take a hit and continue to support the president.
Yeah, well, listen, national security is number one. I think he's right on the money. I think, listen, I have two children. My goal is to protect my children, and I think he's right. I think he's right on the money in what he's doing.
Tom Maioli, great to see you, Tom.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Good luck. Good luck. Let's hope the tariffs don't have to come into play.
Unfolds.
Well, 20 Democrats having trouble giving credit to
the tax cut, right? And now we're dealing with record low unemployment in all groups.
A lot of people benefited, but if you look at the tax cuts, who benefited the most? It is the top of the 1%.
2020 Democrats refusing to give those Trump tax cuts any credit for the good of the economy. So is this going to be an issue for them going forward? Fox Business Network's Jackie DeAngelis, CPA Dan Geltrude, and CNP Global Portfolio Manager Aaron Gibbs joining us now. Thank you all for being here. Jackie, so Tulsi and other people Democrats are saying that the tax cuts didn't help the economy or just help the top of the economy. But you have job growth, which is extraordinary, more jobs than job seekers. The first time in my lifetime, that's about the 19th month we've had that. You have wage growth still going on. If not tax cuts, what?
I think it's a bit of an exaggeration. So definitely the tax cuts help the wealthy, but the administration thinks that will spur economic growth because that money will cycle back into the economy. It has a little bit, but there are other things helping out, as you mentioned as well. We saw manufacturing growth, 11% of GDP. That's actually down from 16% 2 decades ago, but it's strong from where it was. And what we're seeing is that that's contributing to our GDP numbers going forward. First quarter, 3.1%. So we hope to continue and see that move forward. What the problem is right now is the corporate tax cuts. A lot of those companies used that money for buybacks rather than putting it back into the economy. The reason is they're a little bit worried right now to recycle it back into the economy, make these big capex plans because of everything that's going on, all the uncertainty, the problems with China, the problems with Mexico right now.
Right. But, Dan, you know, one of the things that I know I've talked to Larry Kudlow about this, one of the president's advisors, he's very proud of, is that the blue-collar workers have really benefited tremendously from all of the policies, not only the tax policies, but, of course, deregulation, manufacturing jobs. We've had an increase of 500,000 new manufacturing jobs, and a lot of these, the previous administration, President Obama in particular, said would never come back. He said you got to get used to these jobs going away forever. Well, in fact, they've come back to the tune of 500,000. That's progress for blue-collar workers.
There's no question about it. I mean, I think that President Obama was clearly wrong about manufacturing jobs never coming back again to the United States, because clearly they have. But going back to the tax cuts, I don't believe that the wealthy were only the beneficiaries. I think that most Americans did benefit. But the tax code has a way of picking winners and losers. And the winners were those who were in low tax states, and the losers were those who were in high tax states. I have seen many wealthy taxpayers, particularly in my practice, where they're concentrated in the New York metropolitan area, have gotten clobbered by the lack of tax cuts for them. But when you have middle class and people who are on the lower end of the earning spectrum, they have absolutely benefited from the tax cuts. And I believe the economy is clearly showing that, because confidence is up.
Yeah, well, I think it's really how you define wealthy, because certainly, you know, the top, let's say, 0.1% may have benefited. But when you expand, let's say, wealthy to the top 5%, 10%, and start including those people from the higher tax states, you're starting to see the states that have the people leaving the most are these higher tax states. So New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, in last year had some of the highest rates of people moving out of those states. So clearly there are wealthy individuals who are moving because the taxes are so onerous.
And Jackie, you know, a lot of people, I live in a high tax, I live right in Manhattan, so I get clobbered not only by the state but by the city. But I must say, I actually had made a little more, you know, because of the tax changes, because you had an end of some of the onerous tax code that they got rid of. But the bottom line is we had a loss of 350 points on Friday, and a lot of that came because of what is happening on tariffs. Could that eliminate the progress that has been made with the tax cuts?
You read my mind. So the first thing is, most people that I've spoken to have said in their paycheck they have felt a little bit more money sticking to their bones. And obviously it would depend on what they're making. So that was a trend that we've seen over the last year, and it will continue. The second point you made about the market drop that we saw was the worst May that we've seen since 2010 in 9 years.
Yeah, it wasn't just the day, it was the whole month.
People are scared. And when you listen to what your previous guest was saying regarding autos, for example, it's not just going to hit corporations when we look at tariffs that have to deal with China and have to deal with Mexico. If those costs are passed on to the consumer, that will effectively feel like a tax. So that will eat into some of the savings that they've seen.
Although surprisingly, he said he'd still be in favor of Donald Trump because of the effects of the tax cuts and the regulatory cuts.
Well, Tom is clearly a loyal Trump supporter, that he's willing to sacrifice his business sales for supporting the president. But listen, I heard Charles Payne say something very interesting regarding these tariffs.
He only says interesting.
Yeah, yes, he does.
All he says.
But he said something interesting. He said, ultimately, obviously, tariffs are a tax.
Yeah.
But what's going to happen is that people will not accept that tax in the form of tariffs being passed through. They are going to change their buying patterns, right?
That's all.
So now what happens, David, what happens is countries like China and Mexico, if they want to sell into the United States, they're going to have to adjust their pricing.
Yeah.
Now, will that happen? It's a very interesting point of view.
Aaron, we have some stats to back that up. I think we might even be able to show them. The tariffs are cutting imports from China. China imports are obviously down about 15%, but Vietnam imports up 40%. Taiwan imports up 21%. South Korea up 18%. India up 15%. These supply chains are moving away from China to other countries in Asia and elsewhere that can provide the same kind of products.
Certainly corporations are going to move their supply chains as quickly as possible. I think the interesting thing with the proposed Mexican tariffs is that it's going, for many industries, it's much harder to switch your supply chain. Ford and GM, for example, they have manufacturing plants where, and even Ford has 1/3 of its vehicles produced in Mexico. It's not that easy to build a whole new car manufacturing, all the suppliers. So they are our second biggest trading partner. And so we may be able to source avocados from somewhere else, but we're not necessarily going to build a new car plant. And so I think you're really going to see that in the markets. And certainly Wall Street is concerned about this because it's not going to be that easy to switch your suppliers.
Well, even Steve Moore, who's a big supporter of the president, worked with the president, is worried about the Mexican